It's my privilege to be here, and it's good to see you all. Can I introduce the panel? Sybil Jordan Hampton grew up in segregated Little Rock in Arkansas. She was in the second group of students who desegregated Little Rock High School in 1959. She is a distinguished teacher and educationist. Ernest Rip Patton, he was a student, our Rip, at Tennessee State University when he joined the Freedom Riders, people black and white who traveled together on buses and trains to challenge segregation. On the 1961 Freedom Ride, on a Greyhound bus to Jackson, Mississippi, he was arrested and taken to the notorious state prison. He was expelled from university. He decided not to take up a later offer to resume his studies and went on to be a truck driver and jazz musician. He is now a renowned community leader. Eileen Weir is a member of Shankill Women's Centre and a trade union activist. She has spent decades in community relations work, and she continues to do that full time. And Professor Paul Arthur is a scholar and practitioner in international conflict resolution. He's the author of 5 books. He's been a senior fellow at the Institute of Peace in Washington, D.C., and he's been a consultant on political violence and dealing with the past for the UN and the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee at Westminster. Would you welcome all 4 of them, please? For the first 20 minutes or so, I'm going to ask Sybil and Rip just to tell us their story. Sybil, would you just talk to us about growing up in Little Rock, what your parents and you, and then how you came to be in the second group after the Little Rock 9. The second group, desegregating that school, what it was like to go in there. Could you just start on that?
Good evening. I grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas, literally 7 blocks from Little Rock Central High School. And it's really important to note that my parents had a grocery store, a little mom and pop store on a corner, and on the adjacent corner was also a mom and pop store that was Anglo. So that I grew up in a neighborhood that was really a neighborhood that was not segregated. My parents were, as you can imagine, people who were very concerned about the future for me and my brother, for our people. And therefore they were very active in the NAACP, the Human Relations Council, our church. My father was a Boy Scout leader, so that my parents really were activists across the face, activists across the face of the community. I am 3rd generation of my family to go to college, and that's important to note. Therefore, my parents were forward-looking people. My grandfather were visionary people, and people who were risk-takers. Because my parents and my family were, and my brother and I were involved in the youth of the NAACP, we were involved in conversations prior to 1954 about what you need to do in order to make a difference. We were raised in a church and a community that said, since slavery, our people have waited for the promises of democracy to be fulfilled in our lives. And people have died over the hundreds of years waiting for that promise, but you may be the first generation who can realize that promise, and therefore it is so important for you to be prepared to go through the door, and the best way to be prepared is to be well educated. So that you must be very, very focused on doing well every day. Not necessarily making A's, but in doing your best every day. That became so important when in 1959, I became the youngest of the 5 students who re-entered Little Rock Central High School. When I graduated in 1962, I was still in my class, and there were 544 class members, and I was the only person who looked like me. What was quite surprising about going to Little Rock Central High School, I would share with you, was that by the time I came to the end, only 2 people had spoken to me during the 3 years that I was there. And therefore, when you think about what it was like to desegregate the school, the images are of the Little Rock Nine and of all the things that led the president to send the troops. And what we need to understand about change and transition, particularly in troubled times, is that it's a process and different things happen to different people, and then we need to keep telling the stories in order to understand the process.
Sybil, what was the effect on you as a teenager to be shunned in that school? You've said you felt you were diminished by it. Could you explain that? Could you talk us through that?
Well, I felt not angry, because young people have asked me as we've been here this week. I felt profoundly sad, because in my life prior to going to Little Rock Central High School, I was a very vibrant person. I was a student leader. And so I had expectations of being and doing and of being over time liked. The diminishment is that I came to understand that there was absolutely nothing about my being that mattered. That's a rather frightening. It's one thing to think that people don't like you and don't want you, but you think that over time of spending time together, there's the possibility that things will open up, that things will change. But for me to spend all of those years with the same people and to never have them change the way they responded to me, not to have one person in my homeroom look me in the eye, not to have one person smile at me, to truly not be acknowledged was chilling. It was chilling. But one of the ways in which I compensated and coped was there was a program on TV called Casper the Friendly Ghost. And I would say to myself, I'm Casper's wife, I'm the ghostess, and I really did have this dialogue with myself, that I am in this position, and there's nothing that I can do but to stay focused on the goal from the beginning. And therefore, I was very, very studious. I enjoyed my studies. The majority of what I did in the school was involved in school activities. By law, we were not permitted to attend sporting activities. We were not permitted to be in clubs or organizations. We could get no school honors. By law, we were restricted to coming in the door every day, going to class, and going home. And so I would say to you that if I had not been, as my other friends were, confident and loved in the communities from which we came, it would have been not a diminishing experience, it could have been an extinguishing experience.
That is a piercing phrase to use. It's extremely telling. Why were you able to go on in those circumstances? What was it that you could see that made you walk towards it, even in the midst of all of that? There were people coming up to you only to use the N-word to your face. So what was it that sustained you?
First and foremost, I was a child who was raised very lovingly in a segregated era. And what we were told prior to anything at Little Rock Central High School was, you may walk out of the door any day and encounter someone who is not going to respect you, who is not going to treat you with dignity, that you're going to go places where there are signs that say colored only. There are all things around you in this world that speak about you in a way that's less. And our parents and in our church, we were taught that's not the end of the story. That's what they say, but that's not who you are. And you have to hold on to who you are in the midst of all of this. And that was really, I could not have been trained at the last minute to go to Little Rock Central High School. It was a life's exposure and life's teaching by my parents that you must live fully in this moment with all the restrictions, but you also must have hopes and dreams about the future. And therefore you are, I always say I was a hydra-headed monster. I knew what I had to do on a daily basis, but I also knew that I might represent the realization of a promise. I felt that in my bones, that something good could happen in my life, but that I would have to maintain my poise, I would have to maintain my sense of what my parents taught my brother and I, because we both went to the school, and that was, because you will meet a hostile world perhaps, you must take this coal of love and plant it here. And sometimes the ash will be covered over, and you're in a situation in which you feel all alone, you feel maybe frightened, but you have to lean down and blow the ashes away. And that little coal that's in your heart, that's our love, the love of your community, will then send out warmth. And so that's what you hold on. You look in, you don't look out. And my mother told me after I was at Central for a while, because I would ask, why do you think nobody is speaking with me or looking at me? And my mother said, you represent what people in your school have been taught to hate. You are the representative of what people have been taught to fear. But she would always say, if they could get to know you, they would love you. Well, that was my mother was really very sweet. But it was very good, because what she said was, given an opportunity, people could find me to be a delightful girl, but that there were circumstances beyond her control and my control that contributed to what was happening to me. And so the message was always, do not take this personally. This has nothing to do with you, Sybil. This has to do with you as Sybil, who is a little brown girl that people don't know what to do with.
Rip, yes, please. Do you take us, Rip, from just getting involved, 21, Tennessee State, getting involved in the student movement, their big student movement. Just take us from there and then gradually into the Freedom Riders and what happened.
Well, I was a sophomore at Tennessee A&I, Agriculture and Industrial College, and I heard about, the word got around that there's a man in town by the name of Jim Lawson. And he's a student at Vanderbilt, and he had studied the methods of Gandhi. He had been a missionary in India, studied the methods of Gandhi, and he was going to teach us about nonviolence. He was going to teach us the Gandhian way. And so it was by word of mouth or by a rotary phone. And so I found out where the meetings were, and I went to the meetings, and I must say that, just to go back a little bit, my mother said, I knew that you would be a part of this, because early in life, she took me to a movie theater and I was unable to walk into the front door, and I was hurt because I couldn't walk into the front door. So apparently she didn't forget that and I didn't forget it. And so I wanted to do something to make a change. And so I went to the nonviolent workshops, met any number of people. We studied about Gandhi, we studied the Bible, we studied Jesus Christ. We also had demonstrations that we did to each other while we were in these workshops. We could be sitting here and somebody would walk behind me and slap me on the head or push me or act as if they are pouring something on me. We learned how to protect ourselves if we were pulled off a stool or thrown over a lunch counter, whatever it may be. So we learned how to do that. And so in February of 1960, we had our very first sit-in. And it took us from February the 13th till May 6th to desegregate all of the lunch counters downtown in the 5 and dime stores. And to fast forward to May of 1961, the Freedom Rides. Of course, it was started by James Farmer, who was the director of CORE. And they started on May 4th, 1961 in Washington, D.C. They were going to go down through the South, test the facilities on the bus as well as in the stations when the bus would stop. Now, in the early 40s, there was a woman by the name of Irene Morgan who was on a Greyhound bus, I think coming out of Virginia going into Maryland, and she was sitting up front, and they stopped the bus and told her that she had to move to the back of the bus. She was African American, or during that time, she was either colored or a Negro. She refused to move. They took her off the bus. She was arrested. She took her case to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that people that looked like us could sit anywhere on the bus, on the Greyhound bus or Trailway bus, that there was an empty seat, even if it was right up front, the very first seat. That's what the Supreme Court said. But what they forgot in that, what they passed was they did not pass the law that would remove the signs on the front door that said white only, or around the back that said colored only, or said white water, white restroom. They forgot that in that decision. So in 1960, there was a young man, Bruce Barrington, who was a student at Howard University, law student. He lived in Selma, Alabama. So he got on a Greyhound bus in Washington, D.C. to go home. And the first stop that they made where he could get off the bus and get a hamburger or whatever, he was refused at the terminal, the Greyhound terminal. And so he, some kind of way, that was a Barrington versus Virginia. And apparently the Supreme Court had forgot about that, what goes on in the terminal. So in 1960, they said, okay, we're going to add that these signs have to come down off the doors. And so Jim Farmer, who was the director of CORE, C-O-R-E, Congress of Racial Equality, decided to do something to bring his organization up to the level of the NAACP and SCLC, which was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And so he decided to have a freedom ride to test the facilities down through the South. And so on May 4th, 1961, they left Washington, D.C., going down through the Virginias and the Carolinas. And when they got to Atlanta, they had a meeting with Dr. King because they wanted him to go on the Freedom Ride, and he refused to go. And he said, my sources tell me that it's going to get rough from this point on. I would advise you to stop the Freedom Rides right here in Atlanta. So James Farmer said, no, we're going on because we want to be in New Orleans, Louisiana by the 17th of May. And if you know that the 17th of May is a very special holiday, not a holiday, but a very special event on that day.
What's that event?
That is, I knew you would answer me that, Brown versus the Board of Education.
Right.
And so they wanted to be in New Orleans to celebrate that on the 17th, but they never made it. When they left Atlanta, the first stop for the Greyhound bus was Anderson, Alabama. The Klan knew that there were Freedom Riders on the bus. There were 6 Freedom Riders on the bus, but the bus was full of regular passengers. But the Klan did not know who the 6 Freedom Riders were. And so when they got to Anderson, Alabama, the bus terminal is in an alley with 2 buildings on each side. So it's not like buses pulling in beside each other. And so when they pulled in, the Klan blocked the door so you couldn't get off. There were Klansmen on the ground in front of the bus so that the driver couldn't take off. Meanwhile, the others were putting holes in the tires with knives and ice picks. And what they wanted to do, because an announcement was made by a young man that owned a grocery store, he said, on Sunday, a Greyhound bus is going to stop right here in front of my store. And of course, they finally let the bus leave the station, but they also had a car in front of that bus so that it couldn't speed up to 50, 60 miles an hour. There were no such things as interstate at that time. So he was on a highway. And by the time he made it to that store, which was about 6 to 8 miles outside of Anderson, the tires were flat. The driver got off, went and checked the tires, and walked away from the bus. The good thing about what happened there is that there was a man, I don't know if he knew if he was a Klansman, but he gave his father a movie camera for his birthday. And when you see the documentary, that's real action. When you see the burning of the bus, that's real, because the man took that camera and made like he was a reporter. And so years later, when Stanley Nelson was trying to do the documentary, they went to the FBI and said, you must have something else that we don't know about. And it took them 6 months to get that film from the FBI, and they gave it to him, and that's why it's in the documentary. The Trailway bus bypassed Anderson, and they made it into Birmingham. Bull Connor, who was head of the police department, told the head of the Klan, he said, apparently he told him that in the middle of the week, he said, on Sunday, that Sunday was Mother's Day, there will be a bus here with Freedom Riders on it. My policeman will give you 15 minutes at the bus terminal to do whatever you wanted to do to those Freedom Riders. Now, again, there were regular passengers on the bus, so if you had been on that bus, you would have been beaten and not knowing why. And so the beating of the Freedom Riders in Birmingham, the burning of the bus in Atlanta, the Freedom Rides, the original Freedom Riders had to stop. They gave up. Now this is national news, and in Nashville on that same day, that Mother's Day, was that we integrated that theater that I couldn't go into when I was a little boy. And so it was a bittersweet day for us. That night, we called James Farmer, who was the head of Corps. Mr. Farmer, we would like to restart the Freedom Ride. We would like your permission to restart the Freedom Ride. You gonna get somebody killed? Mr. Farmer, we would like to, for your permission for Nashville to restart the Freedom Ride. Again, you're gonna get somebody killed. We asked him that until he finally gave in and said, okay. But then we got a phone call from a man that was hired by Bobby Kennedy into the Justice Department, which was John Siegenthaler, who was a former editor of the Tennessean newspaper in Nashville. And Bobby Kennedy called John Siegenthaler in Birmingham because he was sent there to get Corps out of there, get them on a plane, get them back to Washington, D.C. And so John Siegenthaler is in his hotel 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and he's happy because he did what the president and the Attorney General told him to do. I mean, he's bubbling over, oh man, I did what they told me to do. His phone rings, and it's Bobby Kennedy. And Bobby Kennedy says, who in the hell is Diane Nash? Call her and tell her not to send those people down from Nashville, Tennessee. Well, by this time, we had already had our group of people, volunteers, student volunteers. Our first group had already left Nashville because we had his permission to restart the Freedom Ride. We had got the funds. That were not easy for us to get the funds because the church that was sponsoring us wrote a check, and they left one name off the check, which meant the check was no good. We needed 13 tickets. The check was no good. We went to at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, we went to the richest number man in the city, told him our situation. He cashed the check, and it just so happened he was a member of the church that the check was written on. And he said, when I go to church Sunday, I'll get the other signature and I'll get my money. So he gave us the money to get the tickets for the first group. And we were on our way from Nashville to Birmingham.
Can I, at this point, to complete your story, you go on the Freedom Ride, you're arrested, and you're put in the notorious state prison. What do they do to you there?
Well, we didn't go directly to the state prison.
Eventually.
Eventually, okay. We were in the state prison. They made you strip, men and women, black and white. For every cavity that you have in your body, they searched you. They took all our clothes, and we had the men had boxer shorts and a T-shirt made of raw cotton, not the 100% polyester and all of that, raw cotton. So you know you like this all the time. They would do things to us. For example, we were a singing movement. We were known as a singing movement. And so, for example, we would be in a cell 6x8, a double bunk, steel bed with about a mattress about 1 inch thick, and we would sing all day. If you don't stop that singing, we're going to take your mattress away from you. And so they opened the gate, we put the mattresses out in the hall, start singing again. But one of the songs we would sing, you can take our mattress, oh yes. You can take our mattress, oh yes. You can take our mattress, you can take our mattress. You can take our mattress, oh yes. Now they did that several times, but then if you got tired of that and you didn't want to sleep on that steel bunk, but you knew that what you needed to do was give up your mattress, then when they closed the gate, there was another song you might sing. Ain't gonna let no mattress turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let no mattress turn me around. I'm gonna keep on a-walking, keep on a-talking, marching up to freedom land. So again, we were a singing movement, but we would sing all day and most of the night. And one of the songs that was what we call our wake-up song, a lot of songs came from out of the church. And the one song that was our wake-up song every morning, what you might call a congregational hymn, we changed the last word. The last word in the line is Jesus, and we changed it to freedom. I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. Woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Ain't no harm to keep your mind stayed on freedom. Come on with me. Ain't no harm to keep your mind stayed on freedom. Ain't no harm to keep your mind stayed on freedom. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Walking and talking with my mind stayed on freedom. Walking and talking with my mind stayed on freedom. Walking and talking with my mind stayed on freedom. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah.
You have both given us so much to think about and appreciate. I'd like the thoughts just on what we've been hearing from our two other guests. Eileen Weir.
I feel very humbled sitting on the same platform as yourselves. You know, we've had our struggles here, but I think the struggles that happened in America and the civil rights movement, you know, we learned a lot from yous. We learned what not to do and probably done what we shouldn't have done. But I think it was the brave people in the civil rights movement in America. I probably knew more at that time because I was a bit younger about the civil rights movement in America than I did in the civil rights movement here in Ireland, to be honest with you, because it was news, it was, you know, Martin Luther King, you know, these are people that I grew up wanting to know a wee bit more about. You know, Rosa Parks would be one of my heroes, you know, through all that, and I would be heavily involved within the women's movement here, and I think we need a few songs that we could rehearse within the women's movement. And I see some of the women nodding their head because we only have the one chant or the two chant, and not everybody knows the words, so maybe it's something that we can do. You know, the work that I do here within more human rights and civil rights would be mainly, you know, around the women's issue here, the gender inequality that we have. So, you know, as your struggle still goes on in America, I think our struggle still goes on here, right across this island. Suppose we have a Brexit deal coming up here that we don't even know if we're going to have what we already have coming out of that Brexit, out of that other end. Whether our human rights or civil rights are going to be affected by that is a big, big concern for everybody, but in particular with the women's issue, because we don't have that equality here, and we still have the legacies, issues that we're still dealing with the past. But hopefully the civil rights movement here in the island, that we can actually do something for the future to maintain civil rights and human rights here on the island.
Okay, I'll come back to you. And Paul, just some initial thoughts on what we've been hearing.
My first initial thought has already been stated by Eileen. Tim mentioned that this is our 46th meeting in the past year concerned with civil rights, and some of them have been memorable. I think that tonight, so far, is in a class of its own. I think that we have never been more privileged than what we've heard already from our two main speakers. I just want to take one thing from both Rip and Sybil. Sybil spoke about that her generation could be the first to realise that promise of civil rights. Our generation in the 60s believed the same. And we were inspired by what was going on in the United States, because television by that stage was becoming fairly common. And we were much more interested in what went on in the United States than what went on virtually anywhere else. As a high school student, I was involved in protests against the Vietnam War. And that really was the beginning of my political education. And when the civil rights movement did begin, we genuinely believed that we were going to shift things very, very strongly. And from Rip, virtually the first thing he said when he spoke about Jim Lawson and about learning the methods of non-violence. This is where we go our separate ways. Because what went wrong with us was that we didn't follow that path at all. And I always quote from Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, where he spoke about the four essentials being, first, you gather the evidence to demonstrate that there is discrimination. And then when you've gathered that evidence, you negotiate with the authorities and the understanding that, in fact, those negotiations are going to fail. Thirdly, and this is the crucial one, he spoke of self-purification, which would lead you into non-violent civil resistance. I mentioned this the other night. We had a meeting in the House of Commons. I mentioned self-purification. Someone came up to me afterwards and said, "Is that about changing your blood?" They had no understanding of what it meant. Just as we had no understanding of what it meant. We came from a culture that never did turn the other cheek. And when we reflect, as we've been doing over this past year, on lessons learned, I think one of the most important lessons we have to learn is bear in mind these dead. Bear in mind all the people who've died in the Troubles, from what started out as a highly idealistic movement, but we didn't have the political culture to take that forward. So I say again, what we've got from our two speakers has been truly inspirational.
Thank you, Paul. Do we have a couple of microphones for yourselves? Because I'd very much like to draw you into this. Is there anybody right now who is really keen to say something about what we've been hearing, or to make a few comments on what you see as parallels or differences between the civil rights movement here and in the United States? I think our two guests here, Rip and Sybil, would be very interested to hear reflections on that. What were the similarities? What were the differences? So anybody want to start us off on this? Be very interested to hear from you. Yeah? And remember to hold this thing as I'm doing now, right up close.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. I have to say, I'm very nervous to start with, but...
Oh, you're among friends. Go on.
Just listening to the two speakers, I just realized that there's a lot that we probably inherited from people like yourselves, from the elderly within the Black community, if I may say, because you spoke about how you learned to cope with, whenever other kids pushed you or whenever somebody kicked your lunch or whatever, you learned how to cope, and your parents would tell you, you know what, you turn the other cheek, you do that. Is that something that you've continued to teach generations down the line? Because this is something that I, for one, was taught, and I feel that we've inherited that along the way, and we continue to teach our children. And even in society now, we've kind of like learned that we somehow learn to cope with things that we shouldn't be coping with, if I may say. You find a way to just talking about the latest thing that just hit the media recently, where somebody was racist, you kind of learn to see something else. You learn to see a side that's clean, if I may say, but it's not clean. Don't know if I'm making any sense.
Okay. Did you want to say something to that, Sybil?
Briefly, I think that I don't think that in America we've done the type of job of teaching generations after me what I was taught. And I think part of that stems from the fact that when things look like they're beginning to change, people are so relieved that they want to kick off the traces of the past. And many, many parents have said, I don't want my children to know those stories. I don't want them to have to think about the dismal past. But what we discover is by not knowing the past, you don't have strength and confidence, and you don't know which fights to fight. Because that's the other part of what you have raised here, is there things that you encounter, and the question becomes, what do you do when somebody does something? I don't use the term racist, and I'm going to tell you why. In my life, there have been things that have happened to me, certainly because of my color, and that was at Little Rock Central High School. But then there have been many more things that have happened to me because people in America are not comfortable with women in leadership roles. And in the third instance, there have been things that have happened to me because people don't like bright, thoughtful people in our world. And so there are days when it's not clear to me what the basis of the shit is. But what I think is ever present for me is not to duck, but to take into consideration that there's an obstacle, and to try and figure out, what do I need to do so that they don't win ugly, and that I don't overreact to the obstacle being placed in my path, because there are people placing it there, so I will not be effective as a change agent. So it's not that there aren't things in the world that don't dismay me and make me very, very sad, but when I see these things, I think the best thing is to try to get cracking and be smarter.
Okay. I just want to come back to the question I raised with you, and I want to just reflect on what Paul said. There is a view that whereas the civil rights campaign in the US ended in peace, our civil rights campaign ended in war. Is that valid? Do anyone here want to say anything on that? Sir.
Welcome, guest. We're very privileged to have you here. Yes, ours ended in war. I don't think that was accidental. It wasn't too hard. I'll say this much, it wasn't too difficult to fan the flames of hatred that were already in our society. But I do believe it was engineered by somebody in control. That somebody, because of what was going on in America, because we are in the age of the global camera. You know, Britain didn't want to be seen fighting civil rights marchers. They didn't want exposed to the world the sectarianism and the segregation that was going on in Northern Ireland. But they could be seen to be engaged in fighting terrorism So they used the one community in Northern Ireland. This is very important. The one community. Different traditions, but it's one community. You said, if they got to know that little brown girl, they would love her. That's why we had segregation in Northern Ireland, right? If Catholics and Protestants in working class areas got to know each other, they would love each other too. So I'm appealing to the younger generation here today, right? Don't be sucked into what might be coming down the road again. No, reach out to one another. We're not going back to the past. You know, I marched for civil rights in Derry and in Belfast. And I can see here tonight members of both traditions who marched at the same time on those civil rights marches. I know some of them. They're here tonight. I know others who are not. But I want to tell you, when I look back, something very significant. I didn't realize it at the time. But you know, as we get grey hair, we look at things differently when we look back. I seen fellow RUC officers. So did the cameras, but they didn't pick it up and they didn't show it. And I remembered pushing some of their colleagues to get involved in beating down civil rights marchers. The naked aggression, the sectarianism with some of those RUC officers who led those charges were abhorred by their fellow colleagues. And they were running and pushing them to get into it. To me, that was very significant. To me, if that had been shown in the cameras, perhaps it would have taught many, many people of that day a lesson. So the media had a big part to play in this. The controlled media, and the controlled media is still there today. We lost our civil rights case. We lost where we were going to. We were pushed off the road with violence, and it's still simmering there today. So that's what I'm saying. We have a lot to learn from what our guests have said, speakers have said here today.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Eileen, I'd be very interested to hear your reflections on this. I mean, did your community... First of all, what were you doing in 1968?
I was still at school. I was only a child.
Right. What were you... What was being said in your community at that stage? That's what I'm really interested in. No?
You know, I think was born too late, because I would have loved to been where a lot of people in this room were with the civil rights. I was 13 years of age when the civil rights marches started here in Northern Ireland, and within my community, I came from I lived on Shankill, born and reared on Shankill. My community background was Protestant. And in saying that, I didn't in them days know what a unionist was or a loyalist, because those were words or terms that weren't mentioned within the community that I grew up on. There was a unionist hall in Tennant Street, and I just thought that's where people went for a wee tea dance into the unionist hall. So, you know, loyalism and unionism only came out of the Troubles, out of the war. And I think that was because there was Republican and nationalists came out of that as well. But I grew up believing that the civil rights belonged to the Republican movement and the nationalists, because that was my community background. 69, 70, I probably was the same as any other teenage kid at that time, gathering milk bottles to make up petrol bombs. You know, that's what you done. That was, everybody was doing it. Because then I believed that was protecting my civil rights, because I didn't understand it. And it was only when I got involved in the trade union movement that I realised what the whole civil rights and human rights was all about. Because I wasn't, now, although my family was a mixed family, I played as a child in Ballymurphy, which was predominantly Catholic. When the trouble started, I couldn't go there to play anymore. So it was a bit like, you know, you weren't safe. But those were my cousins, those were my friends. So we weren't told that you're going to be fighting with Catholics or anything else. Everybody was protecting their own areas at that time. And the first thing, I think there was 2 turning points. One, probably the biggest turning point, was the strip searching of Armagh, a women's prison. And I was a trade union activist at the time, and we discussed it at a women's advisory committee. And I sort of was going in there going, I can't say this in my own community, that I'm campaigning against strip searching, because at that time it was a Republican issue, because it was Republican women prisoners that were being strip searched. So if a wee prod from Mishangle campaigned against it, I probably would have been on the first lamppost with a lot of tar and feathers over me. So a lot of the stuff that I done and campaigned for civil rights and human rights was all done under the wire, and it was done through the trade union movement.
Can I ask you, Eileen, you said that unionists and loyalists saw the civil rights movement as not for them, for nationalists and Republicans. Why was that? Was that something in unionism and loyalism, in the psyche, in the culture? Why was it?
I mean, I blame it on the unionist politicians at the time, because, you know, unionist politicians at the time, a lot of people didn't realise of, you know, the housing issue. They didn't realise on a lot of things that was happening within the Catholic community, because it was happening in their own community. You know what I mean? There was a lot of Protestants didn't get to vote.
Yeah, one man, one vote.
One man, one vote.
Applied as much to Protestant and loyalist communities as to nationalists and Republicans.
Protestants didn't realise that they had the right to do that. And again, with the whole housing crisis, where if you came from a Catholic background, you know, you were at the bottom of the list. And, you know, the Coal Island and Dungan, you know, proved that, where, you know, Protestant single woman gets a house in front of a Catholic family with a lot of children. So there was no... I always say, and this is a personal thing, within my community, you went to school, and you left school and you got a job. Women, young girls, you left as soon as you weren't encouraged to go further, where my brother was encouraged to go further, to go to university, go to high school, that. But the culture within was women were the mothers, they were the housekeepers, they were the ones that just went out and worked. So there wasn't the same type of culture, where looking back and talking to other people of my age at that time, they knew they weren't going to get a job if they left school. And they didn't matter whether they were male or female, they were encouraged to get an education and to educate themselves and to fight for their rights. That wasn't the case of me growing up, because we were told by our unionist politicians at that time, you were all right, we'll look after you. Now, they've really looked after us, like, you know.
I want to get back to the parallels, links, resonances between the two campaigns. You mentioned the homeless issue, or the issue of housing. In June 1963, what I've read, I think it was Breege Rogers who wrote about this in a recent article. She pointed out that in June 1963, there was an organization called the Citizens Homeless League. There were 2 women leading it, Anne McChrystal and Patricia McCluskey. And the Citizens Homeless League staged, according to Breege Rogers, the first protest march of the whole civil rights movement. Now, are you, Rip, able to reflect on whether there was any consciousness in the state? I mean, I can understand if you're saying, what? I mean, we were kind of preoccupied at that stage, right? Was there any consciousness of what was happening elsewhere? Would June 1963 have preceded the big protests in the US? What's the link? What's the timeline here? Can you help us with this?
Not very much, because I was a part of the civil rights movement from 1959. I was very active from 59 through probably 62. I was expelled from school as taking part in the civil rights movement. 14 of us from Tennessee A&I were expelled from school. Now, I was a music major, and in order for me to pay for my tuition, I had a jazz group, an organ trio jazz group, and we played at the nightclubs in Nashville.
But the movement was already well underway by then.
It took us 4 years to desegregate all of Nashville.
Okay.
Anything that you can think of was segregated. Any facility that you can think of that whites could go into, blacks, colored people, Negroes could not go in there, and it took us 4 years to desegregate all of Nashville.
And by that time it was 1963, was it?
64.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, because that'll come as a great disappointment to those people who believe that the Citizens Homeless League started before the Americans ever got to think about civil rights. But anyway, that's a little historical footnote. You were saying?
Now, that's just in Nashville. There are other cities in the South that were still segregated. And I just know the history of Nashville. And even today, there are cities in the South that are segregated. For example, going back to segregation, St. Petersburg, Florida, Pinellas County School Board are eliminating school buses. And so that means that all the little black kids live in an area where they're going to have to go to a school, and it'll be all blacks. All whites will go to a school where they're going to be all whites, and others will go to private schools because they can't catch the bus to go to what used to be integrated schools. So that's segregation all over again.
It's starting again.
Yes.
Paul, to go back to what Eileen was saying about unionism, loyalism, its leaders, it is fair to say that there were those unionists who identified, who reached out to the civil rights movement. Ken McGuinness wrote a letter in protest to Dungannon Council. Chris Majimsey has spoken of watching the protests and his head telling him, it's nothing to do with you, you have nothing to do with it. His heart saying, I want to be in that march, I want to be in that protest. Could you reflect a bit on that, Paul?
Yeah, I was thinking when I was listening to Eileen about the Shankill in the 60s. I was at Queen's from 63 to 67, and I was a member of the Young Socialists. And one of the things we used to do was sell our left-wing papers, and we brought them into the pubs on the Shankill at the weekend. And we got a good reception. And what they said, and this really is where the big difference does come, they would have no difficulty identifying were it not for the national question, were it not for the question of Irish unity. And they thought that any concessions made by unionism was going to lead towards, the realisation of Irish unity. So there was, and in fact, during some of the meetings we've held in the past year, I noticed it in particular when we were in the Skynos Centre in East Belfast. There was a very strong trade union, left-wing tradition among people who worked in the shipyards all their lives, but they couldn't express it. And again, I can think of in the early days of the civil rights movement, particularly in Derry, where Eamon McCann and a number of us went across the Fountain area to try to appeal to the Protestant working class that this was about rights for everyone. But it was their leaders. There's no question, Eileen is right. It was the unionist leadership who switched them off and said that they would be looked after. So while there were individuals, and in fact if you go to the reform programme, Terence O'Neill eventually pushed through one man, one vote, And Richard Ferguson, another Unionist MP, had to resign because he also supported one man, one vote. There always were people inside that community who realised that things needed to be done. But the national question got in the way of everything. People were not going to pay attention to rights when they believed that that what they were involved in was an existential crisis. If we can see these demands to these people, we're in a slippery road to Dublin. And that's the way their leaders were able to sell it to them.
I've just noticed here a piece that I collected by Patrick Murphy in the Irish News. He writes a regular column. And he says, when we marched and sang "We Shall Overcome," we were wrong in terms of creating a non-sectarian society based on equality and normal politics. Through nationalist opportunism and unionist intransigence, we were overcome. But that will not turn up in all the civil rights histories, because many of them will be bunk. Patrick has his own, on occasions, jaundiced view of things. Do you think he has a point, Paul?
Yes, he has a point. It's by no means the whole point. He has a point. And again, it's one of the things that we have been reflecting on. You know, the way that we allowed things to drift. And it's worthwhile pointing out, one of the speakers making a comparison between Ireland and the United States, it's worthwhile making the point that in places like Watts, in many parts of the United States, the African American population did rise. You know, the Martin Luther King version is only one version of what was going on. So the complexity, I think, is very important. We need to recognize that. Equally, when we set out, I would say that by February of 1969, as early as that, the original ideals of the civil rights movement were going down the panhole. Because you had a march which I helped to organise, the People's Democracy March, from Belfast to Derry, which tried to use as its model the Selma Montgomery March. And in Selma Montgomery, we know what happened when the first time they went across at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, but they regrouped, and the second time they got through. And that was on the basis of non-violence. We didn't have that. And for that reason, that was one of the reasons why we were going nowhere.
Sybil, bring it up to the present for us. What is the importance, talking about the inheritance of civil rights and the movement, what's the importance of Black Lives Matter? Can we talk a little bit about that as you see it?
The importance of Black Lives Matter is that young people in my community who have been disaffected and really on the sidelines have found their voices and have mobilized to seek change, or maybe I wouldn't say to seek change, but to voice their concerns. I certainly feel that very strongly, and I do believe that they are on the journey to seek change. But they are very much related to another movement in the United States, which was the Move On organization. And they have a lot in common with them in that these are young people who are disaffected, who are very concerned about change, but who don't have the nucleus of organization that you saw in the civil rights movement. One of the other things that's striking to me about Black Lives Matter, and I'm an observer, I don't know young people who are really intimately involved, is that unlike the civil rights movement where you had people who knew the past and taught about the past, you had old and young, Black Lives Matter really is the young talking to the young. And so that one of the concerns I have is the lack of perspective within the work that the young people are doing, and the tension around what an old woman like me what I have to say and why that matters. That is something that we really have to rectify and to address. Is there a way for people like me and Rick to have conversations with those young people without their believing that we want to tell them how to do it?
Just interested to know your reflections on Black Lives Matter, Rip.
My reflections on Black Lives Matter. I grew up in a neighborhood where Black lives mattered. And what I mean by that is if I were to ask my mom if I could go and visit a certain friend who lived, let's say, 4 blocks away over here. And she said yes. And then we decided, this friend and I decided to go to visit another friend over here. By the time I got home, my mother knew that I had been where she gave me permission to go, plus where I wasn't supposed to be. Black lives mattered. Today, I see when they say Black Lives Matter, I see a whole different thing than what we had in the Civil Rights Movement. Black Lives Matter during the Civil Rights Movement, but we were organized. We didn't have bullhorns. We didn't have banners to carry, and we were not loud. We had a press release. We had a person to talk to the radio and to the TV sensibly, not in an angry tone of voice, because they wanted the news media to hear what was going on. We did not burn, we did not loot, and you have that in Black Lives Matter because you don't know who's in your organization marching for a cause with you, and there are people who loot. Now, sometimes they don't have a spokesperson. We had that because nonviolent was the first thing that we thought of. And what we wanted, for example, April 19th, our lead attorney's home was bombed. 1960, April 19th, our lead attorney's home was bombed. So Diane Nash asked one of a person, Bernard Lafayette, to go out to Tennessee A&I, asked the president if he could use the microphone system that went all over the school. Our speakers were on the outside of the buildings. They were not in the classroom. He made an announcement that we are having a silent march from that campus all the way downtown, which was 3.5 miles, to the courthouse to talk to the mayor about desegregating the lunch counters. 3 abreast. The 3 of us in that march, we could not talk to each other because we wanted Nashville to hear footsteps. We didn't have signs. We had 2 people to speak for us. The only time I heard a loud roar or hand clapping was when the mayor, Diane Nash, asked the mayor, said, Mayor West, do you think it's fair that we can go downtown and shop but not be able to eat at the lunch counter? He said, I don't think it's fair. And then that's when the students clapped. Later on that afternoon, he had a news conference in his office, and one of the reporters said, tell us about what you felt like when you answered that young lady's question. He said, when she asked me, did I think it was fair that we can go downtown and shop but not be able to eat at the lunch counter, I had to answer her as a man and not as a politician. And so I always say, what if our politicians would act like men and women instead of politicians?
Eileen, I want, as we come into the last segment of this discussion, and by the way, if you want to say something, put your hand up, and we'd love to hear from you. As we come into the last, can you hold it for 1 sec? We come into the last section, Eileen. I want to talk a bit about the importance of legal frameworks for rights. Legal framework, I mean, how conscious are you, Eileen, of the absence here of legal frameworks around protection of the rights of women, around the rights of people with disabilities, the rights of migrant families, the rights of children? Are you very conscious of that in your work?
Absolutely. When somebody had said about, a Good Friday Agreement was our sense of hope. Instead, it has been our sense of hopelessness as far as women are concerned. A lot of stuff in the Good Friday Agreements, we thought we were going to get a Bill of Rights, which we still don't have. At the minute, we're still fighting on the abortion. On some mother cannot give their daughter or take their daughter, even if she's 12 years of age or 14 years, for an abortion, there's a life sentence on that mother for doing that. The childcare, where we have very little childcare here, we don't have a gender balance within committees that are talking about peace building. They don't recognise 1325. The list just goes on and on.
1325?
Yeah, it's European UN Declaration of 1325, and that's giving women the right to sit round the table who have come out of a war. Britain does not recognise that we were in a war, so we don't be recognised as a 1325, even though we have a 1325 committee in Stormont. I don't know, but they do talk about 1325, but we don't get it. We're going down the road of women in peace and security. I work across all the interfaces in North and West Belfast and have yet to be sat down at a table when we're talking about anything to do with those communities. We still have the gatekeepers, people who are down round the table all the time. I think we need those people round the table, but not only those people round the table. What we're sort of way saying that I don't want to be the person that keeps saying where's the women. I want the men round the table asking where the woman is, not for me to be pushing that. So until we get that, and until we get our communities on the grassroots level, because that's where I work, you know, the biggest thing that has probably hit our communities right across was the welfare reform. And that has been something that has penalised women. The two-child tax credit penalises women. You know, the rape clause within the two-child tax credit, it has been lifted. But we had to fight to get that lifted. That you couldn't claim, if your child was raped, you had to say you were raped. That child would have carried that with them all their lives for you to be able to claim a benefit for that child. And this is 2018, you know, so there's a lot out there. The list goes on and on and on.
It does. And you mentioned, Eileen, a Bill of Rights. As I understand it, there are two academics, Anne Smith and Colin Harvey. Maybe Paul, you could reflect on this, or anybody out there can, who have actually prepared a draft Bill of Rights for here. Which I see nods in the audience. As Eileen quite rightly points out, this is supposed to be, this was a promise in the Good Friday Agreement that there would be a Bill of Rights. And so far there isn't one. In December last year, Colin and Anne produced a draft Bill of Rights. Fearful, they said in their accompanying articles, that the British government would follow through on a commitment to repeal the Human Rights Act and replace it with a British Bill of Rights, and possibly withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights. Can anyone share something more with this on it? Patrick, did you want to? We get a microphone, is there?
Yes, I think, Seamus, there are two issues. Firstly, it is under the Good Friday Agreement, the Human Rights Commission, they do the advice for the Secretary of State. And under the chairmanship of Monica McWilliam at that time, she finished the task. She gave the advice to the Secretary of State with the full text of the Bill of Rights. Yeah. But what Colin say, it is another one because of the Brexit. It will be, you know, the British government intended, I think, over the last 10 years, to take away, you know, the European Convention. Instead, they install, you know, the UK Bill of Rights, which is less protection. Yeah. Of course, you know, far worse than the Bill of Rights proposed by the Commission at that time by Monica.
Okay, thank you. I want to bring you in now because I want to hear what you wanted to say, but if there's anybody else who wants to reflect on the legal framework, the absence of it, and what's going to happen to the projected Bill of Rights. Yeah.
So my question is largely aimed towards Paul. So I'm curious to have your reflections a little bit about that, the turning points in the civil rights movement, and thinking a little bit about what Rip said in terms of the preparation that had gone years in advance for being able to conduct nonviolent social advocacy and nonviolent action, direct action to advance things. And I'm wondering if you, with the benefit of hindsight, were to go back and turn back time, is there a moment in time when you would have done something different back in those days?
That is very difficult to answer, largely because, as I was saying earlier, we just didn't have a tradition. It wasn't part of the Irish psyche to approach things from a non-violent angle. I mean, in a strange way, the closest example we have to it is the hunger strikes. And the hunger strikes, before the hunger strikes in 1980-81, I think 12 Republicans had gone to their death from the beginning of the century, as saying the only way that they could have their rights is to give up their bodies. And, you know, that's following a non-violent tradition that goes back certainly into Eastern philosophy. It was something which we didn't practice. When we started out, I remember being here in Queens in, I think it was the McMorty Hall, where Conor Cruz O'Brien came to address us. And this was the early days of the civil rights movement. And he said, you know, what conditions are like, and he was thinking in particular of Derry. He says, there you have frozen violence. In other words, with partition in 1920 and the trouble that came after that, then we settled down into a very, very uneasy peace. But that was frozen violence. And he says that once that begins to thaw, then things are going to break out and you will have no control over it. Now, we who were in that audience, of course, ignored him. And I think that, you know, I was a member of the CND, was a member of various pacifist groups, but the people who were involved, that you could count on the finger of one hand. So really, it never was part of the agenda, unfortunately.
Yes, of course you can. Sybil.
One of the things that has been striking to me this week as we've been talking to young people are the number of young people who reflect on their experiences at Corrymeela and who believe that in the integrated schools, that going in the manner in which they go and the thoughtful reflection, they tell me, to a person, the students talk about the peace that they feel there and the sense of community and the sense, just this good sense. And I, after all of these conversations, am just so struck by the fact that there is a gym here in Corrymeela and the work that's being done there and the young people who are in these schools. We had one experience this week where students came from 5 different schools to an integrated school. And there were young people from Protestant schools, from Catholic schools, and I was struck by the fact that as they sat in the audience, they were sitting in their little pods. But then there were leadership young people from the groups who then came to us separately in the afternoon who had been involved with the work that Sean and the people at Corrymeela conduct. And I thought, there I saw so much hope, and I really felt young people being vibrant and really being able to talk about the future in some very positive way around a number of issues, women's issues, LGBTQ issues, and so I just really want to say that I am very pleased to be here and to be here under the sponsorship of Corrymeela, because for me, and for the values that I espouse and for the things that are dear to me about the future, I want to be associated with the type of organization that takes the kind of stand and is building the kind of community that I think is going to stand Northern Ireland in good stead in the future.
Thank you, Sybil. Thank you. Now, We have a number of people who want to contribute. I go to you first, sir. You've been waiting patiently. Then I'll come to the middle, and then yourself.
First of all, I was part of the group on Tuesday in Macrofeld, and it also struck me to each Sybil, it was a pleasure to meet Sybil and Rip, that the community, the sixth form students in particular, really had a better message. But unfortunately, we grew up in a society where people weren't divided by the colour of the skin. They're divided by your name, what sport you played, what school you went to. And that is one of the reasons why maybe the outcome here was slightly different. But unfortunately, even in education today, not all young people learn what happened here in the 1960s, and they should do. And it tends to be schools from being one background learn it and not the other. And there is ways forward. And I just maybe want to ask Rip there, what is his memory he takes away from his week here with us?
Okay, I'll let him answer that in a sec. Middle here, yeah. Is it Erskine? Erskine Holmes.
I think it would be remiss of us with our distinguished guest speakers here if we didn't point out that we are in a university that was never segregated. I was at this university from 1959 to 1963-64, and it was an integrated university, but there is a form of segregation in Northern Ireland that is self-imposed segregation. And while this higher education institution was totally and absolutely integrated, then we had a Catholic training college for teachers, and we had the equivalent almost, it was supposed to be state, nothing to stop Catholics going to it, but if they went to be trained as teachers in the state training college, they would not get a job in a Catholic school. So our segregation was of a totally different variety to what you're talking about, because it was a form of self-imposed segregation. Now, I speak as a Protestant who was involved with the civil rights movement. I spoke on the very first march from Coal Island to Dungannon in 1968. I was arrested in the march in Derry on the 5th of October. I was effectively one of the leaders of the civil rights movement, and I was a Protestant. That was possible, but it was all the more possible because I was a member of the Northern Ireland Labour Party. And I just remind Eileen that the Northern Ireland Labour Party had 19,000 votes in North Belfast to some 20,000 votes for the Unionists. So there was a time when this community had hope in it that it could unite through the labour movement, but it didn't.
And at the back, sir. Just, will you pass it back, if you would, thanks.
I'd like to perhaps upset things a little bit by quoting President Donald Trump. He was apparently addressing a prayer meeting today, a national prayer meeting in Washington, and I'll quote from him. He was praising people of faith for their contribution to progress in America, and he said, since the founding of our nation, many of our greatest strides, from gaining our independence to abolition of civil rights, to extending the vote for women, have been led by people of faith. Now, there's a serious point here in his, somebody described it as ironic misspeak or maybe a Freudian slip, but there's a couple of points I want to make. One is related to what the last speaker said, and that is the role of churches in contributing to civil rights and human rights. And Ireland has a very mixed kind of record in this in terms of how churches, what churches did in terms of people's human and civil rights. That's one issue. The other one, maybe perhaps I would like to focus more on, is our guests from America. What is your feeling about the Trump administration on this issue?
Okay. First of all, Rip, you were asked a question about what you take away from your visit here. Could you, before I go to Sybil, what would you take away?
Well, I got quite a bit from the students. And one of the questions I asked some of the students when we went to where they came from all different schools was, I didn't call Catholic or Protestant, I said, if you wanted to start an organization, because we believed in the 60s, just like Gandhi did, it only takes one person to start a movement. But with the equipment that you have today, cell phones and the electronics, that's not the best way to start a movement. because we didn't have all those conveniences. And so I brought that out to the students, and I said to one young lady, I said, if you were of the Catholic persuasion and you wanted to make a difference, you wanted to integrate, and someone else was of the Protestant persuasion and they wanted to do something and they found out that you wanted to make a difference, would you trust them enough to bring the two groups together? So there has to be a lot of trust. And really, I don't understand why it has taken so long to integrate here. I asked the question while mics were being moved. I said, if you had been, say, 20, 21 years old, would you have made it a point to go see your cousins when you were told that you could not see her cousins? And she said if she had been at that age, that she would have made sure that she was able to see her cousins. And so I think what I do in Nashville and all around is I talk to young people and I tell them that it only takes one to start a movement. I said what we did in the 60s, we did it not only for our generation, but for the generations to come after us. And I asked them, what are you going to do for your generations? To start thinking about what you're going to do for your generation. Maybe you get married, then you got to do something for your child and then your grandchild, and you've got to carry that on. My granddaughter just turned 7. She was born 9/11/11. That was the 10th anniversary of 9/11. That's her birthday. I told her mother and father, they live in Trinidad, I said, when we have the 60th anniversary of the Freedom Rides in 2021, you're going to fly her to Florida. I'm going to pick her up in Florida, and we're going to celebrate the 60th anniversary together. She's going to write a children's book about her experience. Because I want her to, when she was born, I gave them 2 8x10 pictures to put over her bed. One was a natural photo of me, the other one was my mugshot. Now I knew that she wouldn't know who that was up there. But then they came to Nashville to visit, and we went to Memphis to the museum. I had never said anything to her about my going to jail or anything. And she's running in front of us. She was 4 years old. And when there's a wall that has all the mugshots. And the next thing I heard was, "Granddad, Granddad, Granddad," and she's running back to me. "I found your picture. I found your picture." And she took me right to my mugshot that's in quite a few museums. But I want her to know that she can make a difference. And so those of you who have young people, young children, and you know the history of what happened here, talk to them about the history. Because if they're not getting it in school, they need to get it from you. And let them make that choice. If you're a Catholic and they want to marry a Protestant or somebody else, that's up to them. Now I'm saying quite a bit here. But they know the route, which way they want to go. And the only way you're going to come together is to let these young people know their history, and it'll be up to them to make a change for their generation and the generations to come. Now, that may not have answered your question, but
I think it has. I think it has.
That's the way it is.
Can I slightly rephrase the question that was raised by the gentleman towards the back, Sybil, and ask you what I asked you on the radio earlier? How do you see the challenges now for you as an African American and a woman in an era of very contrasting presidencies, Obama's and Trump's? How do you see those challenges now in this era?
I feel weighted down as a person. I had more passion and enthusiasm and optimism in 1959. I am not hopeless. I have not lost my belief that we're going to get a little further on this million-mile journey. But I must say that I never thought I would be 74 years old and find myself in a place where I don't believe that the values of the type of community and world that I want to live in are being mirrored in the people who provide leadership in my society.
Can I finish just by asking each of you the question, what did your civil rights movement achieve? Paul.
I just go back to Sybil's last remark about, she says she's not hopeless, and the optimism she shared in 1959 or whatever. I, throughout my life, have been an optimist. And for the first time in my life, I feel a real sense of pessimism because of what's going on in the wider world with Brexit and the political conditions in the United States, etc. What did I think we achieved? I think that we demonstrated that a people could rise above things. And I think that that's why I think that hopelessness will be overcome. When Martin Luther King in Montgomery, after that march, spoke about the moral arc of the universe, I think that that's exactly, the moral arc of the universe bends low, but it will come back. And I think the moral arc of the universe is the answer, and I think that that's what we began to discover in our civil rights movement.
Eileen, what did it achieve?
I can only sort of talk because I wasn't there at that time. I was behind it, but what had I go back a wee bit further because I go back to the suffragettes and what the suffragettes done, and you know, and contrary to other people's point of view, but women's movement in Northern Ireland and in Ireland is strong and very strong. And we're rising up. That's the theme this year for International Women's Day on the 9th of March at Ryder Square. And it's women's rising up. What it done, if I can give you an example of what human rights and civil rights done for me personally, and it just happened, I used to do a lot of Falls Radio. I used to go over from Mishankle and I went on to Falls Radio and I spoke on Falls Radio. I brought guests over from Mishankle to inform the people on the Falls what we were doing on the Mishankle within the women's centres. And I was doing that much on the Falls, and I was doing that much in Ardoyne, and I was doing that much. These are all nationalist Catholic communities. And I was in the shop in Ardoyne, and it was probably just after Good Friday Agreement. I was in the shop in Ardoyne. That's where I live. I live on an interface at Ardoyne. And a community worker that knew me for years and years and years said to me, I didn't know you were a Protestant. And the only reason that I know that you're a Protestant is because the Andersonstown News has you in the centre pages saying Eileen Weir from Shankill Women's Centre, Protestant community worker over on the Falls. And I think that stand by me because I wasn't being labelled. Well, they probably were. They were labelling me a Catholic. So maybe that was a good thing. I don't know. But I think, you know, the fact that women are friends, we don't have religion, and we were friends and trusted each other before the Good Friday Agreement. And without that movement of women, I don't think we would have had a Good Friday Agreement. So that all came from suffragettes, civil rights, human rights. So I just couldn't just pick the one thing. I would have to go back further because the suffragettes were the civil rights movement of their time for women.
Thank you. We're summing up now, Rick. So what did your civil rights movement achieve?
I think we achieved quite a bit. First of all, we were the first city in the South to desegregate all of its lunch counters. It took us from February 13th to May 10th to desegregate our lunch counters, number one. Number two, if we had not restarted the freedom rides, where would we be today? Okay, so we were willing to give up our lives. We signed our last wills and testaments to go on this freedom ride so that people could ride from A to B or wherever and sit wherever they wanted to and be able to go into the front door and for those signs to be moved. The freedom ride started May 4th, 1961. By September, all the signs came down throughout the South. The other thing is that you spoke of Selma, Alabama. 8 out of 10 of Dr. King's lieutenants came out of the Nashville student movement. There would not have been a march from Selma to Montgomery if Bernard Lafayette had not gone into Selma to start get people to vote. Now, in Marion, Alabama, is where Jimmy Lee Jackson was murdered. They had a meeting there, and at the church, he left the church and went across the street to get some food, and this is when the police from Selma heard about this meeting that Sunday night, and they raided the meeting, and the cop was beating Jimmy Lee Jackson's mother, and he stepped between them to protect her, and the cop murdered him. Now, Bernard Lafayette and James Bevel just happened to be in Meridian at that time. They asked the grandfather, can we take Jimmy Lee Jackson's body from Marion can we march all the way over to Montgomery and lay his body on the steps of the Capitol? And the father and the grandfather said yes. They didn't do that, but because they had to bury him, had to bury Jimmy Lee Jackson. So John Lewis, who's now Congressman Lewis, was also one of Dr. King's lieutenants, and they decided on that first day that they had the march that they were going to march from Selma, 52 miles, to Montgomery, a silent march. And this is when the beatings and the hospitalization of those marchers was on the first day. That's what they call Bloody Sunday. Then Dr. King came to Selma, Alabama. And they had that second march, and this is when he stopped at the foot of the bridge and prayed and said, we'll go back. Now, the actual marchers, those young people were upset about that. They were determined to take whatever the police and those people were going to do to them. And so what I'm trying to say to you is that a number of cities, the Birmingham with the children in the park, that when they were hosed and the dog bites and all that, that was James Bevel. He was in Birmingham. They had just left Birmingham the day of the bombing of the church where the girls were killed. He and Diane were married by this time. He came back and he had a meeting with the children to let them know, for example, how many typewriters do you have in your class? And one young lady, still alive today, she said, we have one in the office, and I use that typewriter. Well, did you know that such and such a school, white school, they've got typing classes? Why do your football players have to repaint their helmets? Because all of this is hand-me-down. And he said, we need to do something about it. A lot of ministers didn't like that, to use children. He used the children to march because the parents are the ones that are at home making the money, paying the rent, paying the bills. Children don't pay bills. So they had a certain day that they were to march out of school and have a silent march. And then, of course, if you've seen the documentary, you see where the dogs and the hoses and all that was going on. And that's why thousands of children were put in jail or in the county farm and all these different places where they were housing them. So again, I think that we have to get our children, tell them the history of what has happened here in Northern Ireland, the true history. And I just asked this young lady the question. I said, if you had been older, maybe in your 20s, would they have stopped you from seeing your cousins? And she said, no. So we have to let our children know. So that's, I think that, and one other thing, if you want to know your history, look at documentaries. Don't pay attention to these movies. The movie Selma came out, and I saw the trailer, but I didn't see the name Bernard Lafayette or a representative of Bernard Lafayette. Selma was on Dr. King's board for his lieutenants to go and make a difference, to get people to vote. And Bernard said, why is that here? And they said, everybody's afraid because Selma was the home of the Klan. He said, I'll do that. And he went to Selma and started talking to the teachers. The teachers were afraid to go down and vote. He went out into the farmland. The farmers were the first ones to come in and attempt to register to vote. Eventually, you know, we had the march and what have you. But in the movie, you didn't see Bernard Lafayette at all. And Marion Alabama is really upset with the people who did the movie because there's nothing there mentioned about Marion Alabama.
Do you know something, Rick? If when you were doing your jazz, you riffed as well as you do and have done tonight, boy, I like to have been at one of your shows, I tell you. Thank you so much. Thank you. And the last word, Sybil, just what did it achieve?
We kindled a fire. We built the fire so well that even when it banked, it provided the energy for so many other civil rights movements, that our fire was not to warm us, but our fire was so that others could come and they could light their own logs and move forward.
It's been a privilege, I think I can say on your behalf, to listen and reflect tonight. What is there left to say that has not been said so eloquently by our panelists? Would you once again show your appreciation for them, please?
Just finally, just a couple of words maybe from Sean. Now, maybe in reverse order, could I really thank Seamus McKee? Seamus McKee. Paul Arthur, as well as an academic, he has been the chair of the Civil Rights Commemoration Committee for the last year. He's led it admirably. He's spoken on many, many occasions. And he's done a sterling job, and he's steered the committee in a very inclusive and formidable way. So thanks, Paul. Eileen is also a member of the committee, but as you know, she's very earthy from the Shankill Road, and she brings that earthy perspective to everything she speaks. But, you know, maybe, Sean, you want to say a few words about our main speakers?
Well, I just want to echo the thanks that Tim's already given. Just say another thank you to Rip and Sybil. It's been an incredible week. Hopefully you got a taste of that. This is what we've been doing all week. I think we all may need to go and lie down tomorrow. We've got one day left. We're up at Corrymeela Centre tomorrow with young people from Ballycastle, so it's not over yet. But again, just a massive thank you for all that you've given us this week.
And could I be bold enough? You started with singing some songs. We Shall Overcome is an anthem for civil rights around the world, but especially civil rights in Ireland. If you would be grateful enough to sing a few lines that we could join in with you, it would be great.
This is not a song that you listen to. This is a sing-along. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe.
We're on to